Hello and welcome to the Erlang Solutions monthly webinar. My name is Mladen Milicic and I'm the VP for the EMEA region here at Erlang Solutions. Today's webinar represents a continuation of a series of webinars we have been running across topics of interest in the world of Elixir and Erlang and dealing with solutions based on the Elixir and Erlang programming languages. Today we will be hearing about Bleacher Report, a division of Turner Sports, and the second largest sport website in the world. At peak, Bleacher Report deliver over 1.5 billion page views per month and serve over 200,000 concurrent requests to their mobile apps alone. Now, Bleacher Report have been using Elixir where the language makes sense and to significant outcomes, details of some of which will be discussed today. We will be running this webinar live, so if there are any technical issues, then please bear with us as we'll try and rectify them promptly. To start by telling you a bit about Erlang Solutions, we are a products and services orientated company, completely devoted to the Elixir and Erlang programming languages and technologies based on Elixir and Erlang. We specialize in the entire Elixir ecosystem. We also provide Elixir and Phoenix training courses, so if you are keen to learn, then please do get in touch. We will be present at the Elixir conference in Orlando this September, so if you happen to be there, then do come and say hello. Just to mention that early bird tickets are now available for this event, so if you wish to use this opportunity to attend at a lower cost, then you're welcome to do that. We are headquartered in London. We have offices in Stockholm, Krakow, Budapest, San Francisco, and Buenos Aires. And there's just over 130 people at Erlang Solutions at the moment. I'm very pleased to say that our speakers today are Dave Marx, the Senior Director of Engineering, and Ben Marx, the Lead Engineer at Bleacher Report, who have been running Elixir in production for the last 18 months. We are truly and deeply privileged to have Dave and Ben speaking at this webinar. And I must say this is very visibly illustrated by the audience numbers present here in their hundreds today. Now I'll finish by saying you are most welcome to pose questions throughout the duration of the webinar by using the chat facility on the webinar's interface. Our speakers, Dave and Ben, will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the webinar. If any questions do go unanswered, you are most welcome to raise them via email using the following address, webinar@erlang-solutions.com. Now, if you're interested in learning a bit more about Elixir or wish to establish whether it could be a solution for some of the challenges your own business may be facing, then by all means, feel free to contact me directly. My email address will be displayed in one of the final slides of today's presentation. I would now like to hand over to Dave and Ben, who will be glad to start us off.
Hey, Mladen, thank you very much. Both Ben and I are very excited about the opportunity to be here and share our experiences adopting Elixir over the last year and a half here at Bleacher Report, and we thank all of you that are joining us today to hear some about that. So this slide here, as Mladen said, Dave Marx, Senior Director of Engineering here at Bleacher Report. I'm joined by Ben Marx, our lead engineer. And here's a little bit of information about the both of us. I've been with Bleacher Report for roughly 2 years now, and Ben joined a little more than a year ago to help us specifically with our initiative around Elixir. So just to provide you a little history of Bleacher Report for anybody that's not familiar, Bleacher Report was originally founded back in 2007 by 4 high school friends that wanted to create a platform that would really be the voice of the sports fan. And what we mean by that is a place where fans could not only consume, but create content around their favorite teams, and not necessarily just the major teams that oftentimes traditional sports outlets would focus around. Over the lifespan of Bleacher Report, things have evolved, and right now Bleacher is somebody that's providing an industry-leading fan experience, one that really allows fans to consume the best news and content available for their teams. Along the way to where Bleacher Report is today, there was a lot of rapid growth that was experienced. And a lot of that can be attributed to Bleacher leadership recognizing and capitalizing on market opportunities. When I look at historical Bleacher Report traffic, there's some interesting inflection points that can be attributed to those opportunities. The first one was Google search really being one of the first sports sites to focus on SEO and recognize the importance and develop a strategy around that. From there, they rolled out their newsletters a few years after that, and again drives a lot of traffic back to the site, something that the site certainly had to react to handle. TeamStream, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is our mobile app, the release of that again saw exponential growth in Bleacher Report traffic, and in recent years, a lot of it has been driven by certainly a lot of social traffic driving us traffic, and then our adoption of social platforms as a distribution channel. So, I would say when I first got here at Bleacher Report and I saw what was going on, they're very much still developing within their monolith, or the original Rails platform that was developed going back 8 years ago. And this is nothing new. For anybody that's gone into startups that have experienced this type of growth, it's commonplace to have a monolith, right, where you kind of beg, borrow, and steal to support the growth of the company. But along with that, you incur a lot of technical debt. There's a lot of to-dos, things, we'll go back and we'll fix that later. There are knowledge gaps where only one developer has institutional knowledge around a piece of functionality at best. And then certainly as Bleacher Report's focus became more on mobile, where the majority of our traffic is, changes had to be made to the platform to support that. So again, nothing new. But when Ben and I were getting involved, it was around the time that we were really looking to break down that monolith and think about the next-gen architecture of Bleacher Report. So to talk about TeamStream, no doubt this is our most strategic asset. The majority of our traffic does come through TeamStream, which is a native app available on both iOS and Android. It has a live stream of content based on the teams that you're interested in. So when you first download TeamStream, you would go and select, in this case, I'm interested in the Patriots, the Warriors, and the Yankees, and then the information that you see when you log into the app is catered around those teams in your interest, as well as, certainly just general breaking news in the sports arena. The streams that you see when you actually dig into these teams are unique lists that feature a variety of articles and media produced by both BR and also spanning the web and social platforms. So you can think of it as one-stop shopping. For the teams that you're interested in, you no longer have to go to the local newspaper and follow these Twitter accounts. You can come to TeamStream and see the best of what's available out there. It also delivers news alerts around both breaking news and just points of interest for those teams that you follow, and then certainly scores and stats. TeamStream itself presents some interesting technical challenges at scale. That stream of content that you see when you first launch the app is both real-time and personalized for the teams that you're following, which means heavy merging and sorting on demand. This doesn't lend itself to an aggressive caching strategy, so it certainly tests any technical implementation that you have. Especially at times of high traffic. And that can be frequent, right? We are within the sports news cycle, and you never know when something is going to happen that's going to see a significant increase in our traffic. Going back, I think back to just July 4th, 2 weeks ago, when some news broke around Kevin Durant coming here to the Golden State Warriors, our traffic literally doubled in probably 5 to 10 minutes. That was news that broke at about 8 a.m. local time here in San Francisco. And again, you have to have a platform that can support that sort of burst of traffic. So on top of all of this, our content is time sensitive. We have to enable our content programmers to alert our users and then display that breaking news around their favorite teams and what's going on. And above all else, we just need to be fast. So taking a look here at some of the numbers of where we are today, for starters, TeamStream has 15 million app downloads. We do roughly 1.5 billion page views per month, about 16 billion global page views over the last 12 months, 250,000 concurrent users at peak. That particular number actually goes back to the LeBron decision of a few years ago, if anyone remembers that. And then we send over 3 billion push notifications a month to our users.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about why Elixir was chosen and a brief history of how Elixir came to Bleacher Report. As Dave mentioned, we've been a Rails shop since the founding of the company, and we're having to deal with all of these different strategies and increasingly more complex caching strategies to try to get the Rails apps to do what we needed them to. And we kept throwing more and more money at it, and it wasn't a long-term feasible strategy. So there were some other languages that were looked into. Go was looked into, Node was looked into, and then one of our engineers at the time was a guy named Michael Schaffmeyer, and he stumbled upon Elixir. And Elixir, for those who don't know, was created by Jose Valim, who was a Rails core team member, and as such, Elixir is a combination of the Erlang VM along with Ruby syntax, so it makes barrier to entry a lot lower. And because Jose Valim is such a respected member of the community and the Rails community at the time, Michael started developing a prototype, and all of these, Elixir became sort of an ideal solution for us in terms of concurrency, which is what we need when we're dealing with all of the traffic, especially with the fluctuations of traffic. We need to be able to handle unpredictable traffic spikes. By allowing us to get rid of these complex caching strategies, it made the code much simpler. And it's built on top of Erlang and Erlang VM. And while Elixir is a new language, the Beam has been around since 1992. It's been used all over the world. And it has a lot of interesting tooling that Elixir gets for free, like the Observer. And we started using this about 18 months ago, so Elixir was a very new thing, and there was a chance that Elixir might not take off, but the concepts that Erlang had in the Erlang VM itself, it'll still be around, and the worst comes to worst, we can switch to an Erlang shop, because we would have understood the Erlang VM having used Elixir. But given the recent success of Elixir, and over the past 2 years at the Elixir Conf, the numbers have almost doubled from about 150 to over 300 last year. And from what I hear, the Elixir Conf in the US this year will be even more than that. So it seems like Elixir is doing very well and will be here to stay. And then, so my background, I don't have a computer science degree, but I studied analytical philosophy and economics. And part of analytical philosophy is logic and metalogic and these kind of things. And so I was actually introduced to functional programming concepts in philosophy courses. So when I first started with Elixir, or functional programming in general, I remember my days at college and found this functional programming approach to be much simpler than object-oriented. It allowed us to approach problems from a new direction, in the sense that you don't have to worry about transforming data through functions, you don't have to worry about inheritance and these kind of things, and it makes it a lot easier to reason about these kind of things. And then, as I alluded to earlier, Jose Valim, being a core member of Rails, brought a lot of the Ruby syntax into Elixir along with F# type, so it made the transition much less scary. I think had Michael tried to bring Erlang into Bleacher Report, it would have been a much more difficult sell, because the syntax, while the concepts are the same, the syntax is very difficult. It's very different and can be difficult for developers to take that on. And developers are like everyone else in the sense that we like to do things in a way that we're used to doing it, and bringing in a new language with a strange or different syntax would have made it much harder to adopt. So we were able to sort of slide Elixir into Bleacher Report because of the similar syntax to Ruby. And this also sort of carried a caveat in the sense that we were writing Ruby-ish code in Elixir, and that's just something that we were able to work with over time. And let's see. So we adopted it very early, as I said. And in fact, the first version of the Phoenix framework that we used, which is the web framework, it was 0.5-dev, and it was at such an early stage that there are no guidelines for the development, and do what it feels natural, which is it's not exactly a confidence-inspiring mantra for a production framework. And at this point, it was a very bold choice. We bet on it at a very early stage. And Ecto, which is the sort of the ORM of Phoenix and the Elixir world, at that point it was changing so often that when you went to the Phoenix docs, it said to go to GitHub to look at the Ecto docs because it was so unstable and so many changes were occurring. And then, so to give you an idea of what was going on in Phoenix at that time, this was our first commit for our first app in Elixir and Phoenix. It was nearly 2 years ago. As I mentioned, the Phoenix version is 0.5-dev and Ecto 0.2.5. This was before even change sets were around, and the model data relationships weren't very well defined, which led to some sort of suboptimal patterns. At least Elixir had reached 1.0. So this was where we started with that. And as with things pre 1.0, there are some advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage was that we were able to grow with the framework, and that we had to follow along, because in the early stages, new releases happened almost weekly, and at one point we'd gotten behind the 2 versions, and it took a lot of time and effort to get back up to date with that. So this encouraged us to constantly refactor and to grow with the framework, which helped us to improve both our understanding of Phoenix and Elixir, as well as to write better Elixir code. And this also sort of ingrained in us the idea that you have to, in order to adopt a new language, you have to constantly refactor, and because of the massive amounts of technical debt that we've accrued over the last 8 years, this has helped us to set a precedent that says we will do our best to minimize tech debt. And as you might imagine, there are a number of disadvantages to adopting anything pre 1.0, which is the unpredictable release schedule, which means that it's harder to plan sprints when you don't know how often things are going to be released. The magnitude of changes in releases can vary. And with pre 1.0, especially with Ecto, we had to do some suboptimal design patterns in order to get things the way that we wanted to do. And they worked, but they didn't work amazingly well, and that led us to later have to refactor and revisit these decisions. And the nice thing about all of this was that it sits on top of the beam, which takes care of a lot of these things for you. So even if you're writing suboptimal code, it still performs very, very well. And then Phoenix 1.0 was released about a little over a year ago, I believe. This meant that the API wasn't going to make these vast breaking changes that we'd seen over the past year before. The release schedule is much more predictable. You have release candidates and all these things, so it's not the same surprise that one day you come in, there'll be a new version of Phoenix or Ecto or whatnot. The more mature libraries, both on Elixir and Erlang, since Elixir sits on top of Erlang, you can use Erlang libraries with Elixir, and one of the more difficult things about dealing with Elixir and Erlang libraries over the past 2 years has been that the dependency resolution was quite difficult, because one library would use one version, another library would use another version, and it would just lead to a lot of dependency resolution management. But that's become much easier, especially when there are Elixir sort of wrappers for Erlang libraries that take care of the dependencies for you, Elixometer being one of them. And then with Phoenix, they have exciting new features such as Phoenix channels and Phoenix presence. And then Ecto 2.0 was just released, and it's a very exciting release in the sense that it's moving away from the MVC pattern that was sort of adopted from Rails and other frameworks, and is starting to talk about more functional concepts in terms of terms of data structures as opposed to models and these kind of things. So that's been very good, and it's been very nice to grow along with that. So this is the app lifecycle of our first app in Phoenix and Elixir. And as most apps lifecycles go, this is pretty common. You have the exploratory phase, and in this case, the exploratory phase was we had this problem. The problem was that our list merging apps weren't fast enough, so let's try Elixir. As I mentioned before, the Ecto had no change sets, so we were doing very interesting things in order to manipulate the data, which weren't the best ways to do that. And because of that, because Ecto's data relationship model and data relationships were incomplete, we had to. This was just a result of that. And we wrote a lot of Ruby-ish code in Elixir in terms of adding these interactors, which are sort of a Rails and Ruby concept that don't really belong in Elixir or Phoenix. But it worked. It gave us the confidence that we needed to move forward. So there's a sort of a dry spell, the definition phase, where no code was really added or deleted, and that was the time when we said, hey, we have this concept, it seems to work well, and then we turned to product and said, how are we going to start breaking apart this monolithic app, and what are the features that you need to let us pull this out and to give us the minimum viable product that we need to put this into production. And the drive to 1.0 actually had a lot of interesting times in it. Not only was it this was our first release into production, this was also Phoenix's release of 1.0, Ecto's release of 1.0, Elixir's 1.1 release, which meant that you can see over the course there are more additions and subtraction. We were adding the features that product wanted, and we were also there's a lot of churn because of the changes to Ecto and Phoenix. But at that point, it was released. It performed very, very well. We were very surprised. Well, not very surprised, but we were pleasantly surprised that everything went as well as it did, because this was our first foray into functional programming. This was the first foray into Elixir and Phoenix, and it was doing things that we had not expected to do. I mean, I remember when we first started with a monitoring library called Xometer to monitor our data with StatsD. I was sure that we were doing something wrong because the CPU use, the memory use were so low, and they never varied, even when more traffic was hitting the servers. But apparently, that's just one of the many benefits of the Beam. And as Dave alluded to earlier, we have these different content types. We have articles, and we use internal and external articles and various other media types. And at that point, we had about 7 content types, and it wasn't easy to add a new content type because of the limitations that we had carried over from Ecto. At that point, we were very happy with the way that the app was performing, but we were still learning, and it was difficult to see how to add new content types. And product requirements are pretty frequently adding new content types and new ways to interact with users and so on. So this was one of the drives in the refactoring stage, was how do we make this more extensible? How do we make this a foundation for going forward? And part of that was that we stopped writing Ruby-ish code in Elixir and started writing functional code in Elixir. You can see these 2 massive spikes on both the addition and deletion, and fortunately the deletion spikes are bigger, which means that we were doing more things with writing less code. We stopped thinking in terms of content types being backed by models and started thinking of content types as just data that flows through a pipeline. And the way that we were able to do that very simply is to use the Ecto change sets and to validate based on the content type and these kind of things, which made it incredibly easy to add new content types. We have about 15 types now, and we added so many so quickly that the people who program the content are still learning how to use them, because now they have an abundance of choice, a luxury of choice, and now they're not exactly sure how to use them the most effective that they can, but this is a good challenge for them to have. And it also makes it incredibly easy to add and modify these types because we've designed them in such a way that it takes about 20 minutes to add a new content type, as before it would take a developer maybe a day or two, and you had to do all of this data modeling and so on. But now using ChangeSet, it's been incredibly easy. And it's also, this is when new developers are when we have mainly Ruby developers, and we hire Ruby developers and transition them to Elixir developers. And this is a way for us to show them this is how we develop apps at Bleacher Report. This is how we adopt a new language, a new framework. Iterative development is very important. If we tried to write perfect Elixir code, we still wouldn't have this in production. Our Elixir code is very good, I think, but it wasn't very good at the beginning, and we've had the luxury of being able to develop to iterate over this many times, and now we're very pleased with this, and our developers are also pretty happy with developing in Elixir.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing on that, I think a lot of credit to our business and product partners here at Bleacher Report who understood that we were embracing a young language, and we've really made it part of our culture within engineering to go back on a regular basis and address that tech debt that you naturally accrue anytime you're developing something. So anytime we have a major release on one of our Elixir apps, a sprint that follows or that will soon follow will be dedicated to identifying and remedying that technical debt, which ensures, again, that not only are we the best position, engineering-wise, for the future, but everyone can feel good that what we've put out there is the best it can be.
Yeah. And I'm just going to talk about some development highlights with regard to Elixir at Bleacher Report. The app that I showed, the app lifecycle graph that I showed before, was essentially our content list management and merging app. We've been able to go from, is this going to hold up in production, to not even having to worry about it. It's quite amazing how Elixir and Phoenix have made our lives so much easier. And we don't have to worry about them as much anymore. Of course, we always want to be prepared to make sure that for major events like the NFL Draft, NBA Finals, these kind of things, that we have proper safeguards in place, but generally we don't have to worry about it even on those nights. Functional programming concepts in terms of data transformation have made both creating new change sets and validating those change sets incredibly easy with very few lines of code. And this content stream app has given us a great foundation to build for other apps and a model to develop new apps. And push notifications was the second sort of most important app that we moved from Rails and Node to Phoenix and Elixir. Our older system was pretty fast, but this push notification system is incredibly fast, and we have content programmers who program the streams that we supply, as well as send out notifications. And right after we released this, they couldn't believe it. We would literally get Slack messages that say, I can't believe how fast this works, because whenever they click the button to send a notification, it would almost immediately appear on their phone. And this was a remarkable achievement for our second foray into Elixir and Phoenix apps, and it was something that was very tangible and real way to show the business team, and as well as our other internal programmers, that this is working really well. One of the things that we were able to do to make this so fast was before we had to use Ruby, and we had to use Redis, and then we had to use external third-party workers to help us send out these massive amounts of notifications that Dave showed the numbers for in the beginning of the presentation. And now we were able to get rid of Redis and as well as the third-party workers. So now we have just an Elixir app that uses a gen server. It's very simple, very easy to reason about, and one of the fun things that people like to do is, especially the business side, they'll have competitors' apps. Some sport alert will go out, a game will end, something will happen, and our app will consistently be the fastest. And and not just a few seconds, but sometimes minutes or even tens of minutes, depending on the time of day and so on. So it's a very rewarding way for us to see that Elixir and Phoenix are doing what we need them to do. And finally, removing external dependencies have been great. None of us here are Redis experts, but we know enough Redis to sort of do what we needed to do. But by getting rid of Redis, that means that we can focus more on Elixir and Phoenix, so we don't have to be Redis experts and Ruby experts and whatever other integration experts. We can just focus on Elixir. Elixir is the self-contained ecosystem that does everything we need it to do, and by focusing all of our energy on that, we become our knowledge of Elixir is at a much greater depth than we could be if we had to spread them across all these other external dependencies and services and these kind of things. And also, we save a lot of money by not paying third-party integrations or third-party clients. We don't have to. We can save money on that kind of thing, which is great. And it's another very tangible way to say we're saving money. This gamble has been good with Elixir. Some NFL draft is consistently probably one of our biggest nights of the year. Everything has to go right for a number of reasons. This is sort of how we gauge the progress over the year before. This is how we present to the business team and the product team that we're doing things the right way. And the draft 2016 was our first major test of our new Elixir apps. We have a few more Elixir apps in production, but the main apps are the list merging app and the push notifications app. The previous year, push notifications, there were some issues with sending out the volume that we needed to send out, and we were also a bit concerned about, are we scaling enough? Do we have enough Elixir, or do we have enough instances of the Elixir apps in production for the content merger as well as for the push notifications? And we probably over-provisioned because the traffic looked the exact same from the monitoring tools that it did on any other night of the year, which is really incredible when you consider that we probably had almost about 200,000 concurrent users that night. And to not see any real significant jump in CPU usage or memory usage or RDS usage is really amazing, and it shows not only that Elixir is doing what we needed to do, but that our knowledge of Elixir has improved over the past year. The push notifications are incredibly important on the draft night. Sports fans are very particular. So essentially, the push notifications on draft night are especially important because sports fans want to immediately get the information. And the year before, we had some issues with ensuring that we were delivering all these notifications, but this year everything went through without any issues. And we sent about 200 million push notifications just in the first draft night, which is about 5 hours. And it was 10 times the performance from last year. And on the server side, it was, from the monitoring side of things, it was completely indistinguishable from another day. And then for all of our Elixir apps, we didn't need to auto scale. We didn't need to have any kind of provisions in case something went wrong. It was just another day. And it really validated and justified all the work that we put into Elixir and Phoenix over the past year and a half.
Just to talk a little bit about some of the business highlights of adopting Elixir. Ben touched on this, but first off, just on the AWS savings side, so Bleacher is 100% hosted on Amazon, and certainly the monolith, again, which this wouldn't be uncommon, can be a resource hog at times. And from the beginning, there was always this promise of efficiency and cost savings that was going to come along with Elixir. And it's one of those things that until you really get into the production environment, you don't know how it's going to materialize or what you're actually going to realize. And I'm the first to admit, as we have broken functionality out of our monolith and stood up new services, sometimes it gets a little muddy when you're trying to attribute individual pieces of functionality to new services, or at least try and quantify the amount of resources that they consume. But I'm confident in saying that some of the functions that were the most resource intensive on the monolith, where I would estimate we required, upwards of, 100 servers in order to enable, now run within Elixir services on 5 servers with, as Ben mentioned, CPU utilization rarely going above 5 or 10%. So we actually believe that we are provisioned, but again, still being rather young adopters of Elixir, we're okay being over provisioned at 5 servers versus 100. We're just fine with that. The other thing I would say, kind of in that same vein, is Elixir has proven so efficient that it's really challenged the way that we think about our scaling metrics. One of the things that we try and do is understand, certainly within a microservices architecture, how scaling one service is going to impact another service, and you cannot scale Elixir based on the traffic throughput or looking at, again, CPU utilization or memory utilization, because it's just not going to waver, as Ben said, with those traffic spikes. So it's something that we're very actively working out. I would put it in the bucket of good problems to have, but certainly a challenge. On the tangible saving side as well, and Ben did touch on this, as we've been able to sunset old functionality like our old notification system, along with that, we've been able to eliminate a lot of internal dependencies, whether it was external worker processes or Redis instances, databases, whatever it is. We've really seen some significant savings there. And I think last is just overall developer happiness. I think Ben's probably can elaborate on this one, but Ben came in and immediately adopted Elixir day one that he was here, and some of the other members of our engineering team that had very strong Rails backgrounds, didn't dive in right away. And I would say the majority of our team now has had exposure to Elixir, and not many folks want to go back. They really have enjoyed it. I'll let you elaborate on that.
I mean, what Dave said, people don't like to change, but we found that people do like to change with Elixir, in the sense that there's the initial hump to overcome in terms of thinking in terms of functions and as opposed to objects and these kind of things. But the familiar Ruby syntax helps that, and then having already created a number of apps in Elixir helps to give people a foundation on which to build from. So typically for a Ruby developer who's interested in Elixir, we will just start giving them small sort of features or clean up for these kind of things on an Elixir app. And most are amazed at how easy it is to get up to speed. Probably, we have the Programming Phoenix book by Chris McCord and Jose Valim and Bruce Tate, and then the Programming Elixir book by Dave Thomas. And that's really all they need to get started. Of course, we try to have more intense code reviews, more thorough code reviews with new Elixir developers. And even developers who at first were pretty resistant to Elixir and say, no, I'm a Ruby developer, Rails is fine, we're still doing Rails and so on. Even they find that after the initial hump, they quite like it and don't really want to go back to it, which is sort of an interesting problem to have, that we have all these Ruby developers and now Elixir developers, and we still have legacy Ruby apps to maintain. And whenever we have even the smallest issue with an app, the first refrain is, well, let's write it in Elixir. And yeah, okay, we we get that, but we need to evaluate that on a more realistic basis. But again, Elixir has just brought us good problems as opposed to bad ones.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting question, which is how do we really make the decision as we're breaking down this monolith and standing up these new services around whether to use Rails or Phoenix? First and foremost, it's a case-by-case evaluation. I would say we think long and hard about exactly what we're porting, what are the expectations as far as traffic and scale looking ahead for the next 5 years. For the most part, if it's going to be a component that we expect to see significant traffic, again, something that's going to require high concurrency, then we're going to lean towards developing it in Elixir. That being said, we certainly don't force anybody to build things in Elixir. Most of our back-end development over the last 12 months has been in Elixir, but it's an ongoing conversation.
And also, I mean, the consequence of refusing to develop an Elixir or continuing to be a Ruby developer means that the projects you're going to be working on are much smaller and more internal apps, like the admin type stuff, card apps, and these kind of things. So, if you want to work on bigger projects, then Elixir is really the way to go for us. And yeah, we are obviously heavily invested in Elixir and Phoenix, and we continue to be more so invested in that. One of the when we train new Elixir developers or Ruby developers going to Elixir, one of the things that has helped us do that so well is by establishing Elixir and Phoenix guidelines. We use Credo, which is, if you don't know about it, it's not just a linter, but it's also a teacher in the sense that it'll evaluate your code, but it'll also give you reasons why it raises errors or why it raises warnings and these kind of things, and it helps us to have the consistent style across all of our apps. Somehow with developing Elixir, I don't know if it's just a new language or if it's just people feel more productive in it, that the developers seem to be more engaged and wanting and seem to progress at a much quicker rate. It's also led to some sort of experimental endeavors that we talk about, and this is more of just, what if we did this or what if we did that? We had a Bleacher Report pop-up store in New York last year. There's a project called Nerves, and it's a very exciting project that uses, you can embed Elixir on devices, and they can all do these kind of things, so that there are all these different tie-ins that you could do with the physical store and with these devices. So there's a whole new world of possibilities that have opened up with Elixir and Phoenix. Yeah, and since I imagine that most of you are either considering Elixir or at least interested in Elixir, this is how these are sort of the guidelines as to how we've been able to adopt Elixir. First is you have to ensure that the team fit is good, because if there's imagine if one person wanted to develop an Elixir and the rest of the team was resistant, it would never go over, because even if you realize all these productivity gains, performance gains, and so on, if the team doesn't want to do it, it's not going to work out. Make sure that you start with simple projects. We found that converting Ruby or other projects to Elixir is a much easier way to go than starting from scratch. Of course, that means that when you have already existing code, you tend to rewrite that code in Elixir, in Ruby, but that's okay, because one of our other important mantras is iterative development, and understanding that new Elixir developers or even experienced Elixir developers aren't going to write the best code the first time. So just keep iterate over and over, and eventually it gets better. As I mentioned before, Credo has been very good for us to teach new developers, as well as to establish a consistent Elixir style across all of our apps. One of the nice things about Credo is that it is opinionated, but it allows you to change some of those opinions. So we have our own Credo file that takes most of the defaults, but changes a few of them to the way that we like them. And finally, although we've been saying nothing but good things about Elixir and Phoenix for the last hour, temper expectations. If you're a small shop, you might not see the massive performance gains that we've seen. and as well as understanding that some developers might not like it, or that your experience might be a little bit different. But don't expect, don't drink the Kool-Aid, as the expression goes. Understand that there will be hiccups and there will be problems, and we've had even one of the constant refrains for new developers is, well, I know how to do this in Rails. Why can't I just do this in Rails? And it's like, well, you have to, there's a learning curve, and you just have to stick with it, and eventually those how you do this in Rails become, oh, now I know how to do this on Elixir, and I don't want to go back.
So if you are going to take the plunge, some recommendations we have here around adopting Elixir. First and foremost, leveraging the great documentation that's available on both the Phoenix and Elixir websites. In addition to the books that Ben mentioned, these are an incredible resource. There's very active Slack and IRC channels available for support just about any time, hopping on there. Again, one of the advantages of the small community is there's really a culture of support, and certainly should feel free to dive in there. Meetups are something that we embrace here at Bleacher. We've been involved in the Elixir SF meetup for a while now. There are also some great Erlang meetings, and certainly plenty of overlap there. I think at this point there are Elixir meetups just about every major city, so there's likely one anywhere you are. Exorcism.io, this is a great site not only for just Elixir but also for any languages that you work with. If you're unfamiliar with it, it provides practice problems for over 30 languages. And they're really kind of practical problems. So not so much, hello world type challenges. Actually, how do I really implement something or solve a problem that I would see out in the wild, so to speak? And then
they also give feedback from the community members as well. So it's not just right or wrong. And again, they also encourage an iterative approach to problem solving, which I think is very good.
And then certainly last but not least is Erlang Solutions, our host today, and they've been a tremendous resource to us here at Bleacher Report. We engaged with Erlang Solutions shortly after that first production release and asked them to come and really spend some time on site with us here in San Francisco, reviewing our systems, really embedding with our engineering team and educating them on the best practices, again, to ensure that we're getting off on the right foot. It's proven to be incredibly valuable. And it gave us further confidence in the work that we had done and the direction that we were headed. And to that end, we continue to engage with Erlang Solutions on a regular basis. We look forward to having their consultants come on site with us, review the work that we've done since we last saw them, and certainly, again, ensure that we are adhering to the best practices and building things the best way that we possibly can. And I think that, to their credit, this is something that can be intimidating to internal engineers when you have, a consultant come in. And I would say that, the folks that we've worked with have meshed very well with our team, and this is something that has really been embraced by the entire engineering team here, and they look forward to the time that we have people on site to work with them.
Yeah, and it's also nice just to, having worked with them in the past, is to, when they evaluate your code, to not to say that it's good code, to say that you've improved, or these kind of things. So it's nice to have that external validation, especially since I guess traditionally Erlang Solutions has been, all Erlang. They've been especially helpful when dealing with lower level issues, with talking about the VM and understanding the internal processes and stuff that, as an Elixir developer you don't necessarily need to know, but it's been really helpful to get a much deeper understanding of how the VM works, and it's been really great to have that external validation.
So that's about it for us. Up at the top here, there's an email address that you can send any questions that we aren't able to get to over the last 10 minutes. Contact information for Mladen, Ben, and myself, and certainly feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have about anything. I'll go ahead.
Dave and Ben, thank you so much, and I'm sure everyone else will join me in thanking you for a most inspiring talk on your use of Elixir and your achievements with Elixir. To hear about use of an emerging nascent language at the second biggest sports website in the world, and with Elixir supporting mission-critical use cases, is truly insightful, and I think will motivate much further use of Elixir. But just to briefly reflect on the final slide, if you are interested in learning Elixir and picking up Elixir as a skill, then we have some resources online for you. You can obviously attend our events, our boot camps, both on Elixir and Phoenix. And finally, if you're interested in trying Elixir out yourselves, and if you need a bit of help in terms of consulting and development, then you're welcome to drop myself personally an email or use this email address, write to us, let us know how we can help. But more importantly, I'd like to open up the question and answer session. And before I do that, I'd like to thank everyone for an absolute avalanche of questions. And I can tell you now that there is no way we can answer all of them in the time given. So we'll be as efficient as we can and try and honor as many of our members of the audience as we possibly can. But I can also tell you that all the unanswered questions we will answer in writing after the webinar. So again, to try and answer as many as we possibly can, I'll start with the first question for Dave and Ben. So Fernando, one of our audience members, is asking, why did you use Elixir instead of plain Erlang? And if you had time to learn one Beam language, would you go for Elixir or Erlang, and why?
We decided to use Elixir because we're Ruby developers, and I've always had this sort of an interest in functional programming, and I've played with Scala, Clojure, Haskell in the past, and I've never worked with Java. So with Clojure, you have to learn the Clojure syntax, the functional programming concepts, as well as the sort of peculiarities of the JVM. And with Elixir, since we already knew Ruby, we only had to learn functional programming concepts. So it was, I think the barrier to entry was a lot lower. Erlang syntax is quite different and can be very intimidating, especially the Erlang documentation is very good and very thorough, but it can be quite overwhelming for someone. And the Elixir documentation is also has a much lower barrier to entry. And with regard to the Beam, for most Elixir developers, you don't really need to know that much about it if you don't care to, because it handles things so well. And I think that as people become more experienced Elixir developers, of course, they're going to want to learn more Erlang. So I'm spending the spare time that I have to learn more Erlang. But for developers who just have a cursory interest in using Elixir, I don't know how deep they need to get into the Beam.
Thank you for that, Ben. Now, again, I must thank our audience. We're being absolutely buried with questions. What we can promise is to answer all of them. If not now, then answer the webinar. And right now, we will answer all the questions in the order in which they were received. So straight on to the next question for you, Dave and Ben. Amandu, one of our audience members, is asking, what is your database setup which accompanies your Elixir setup?
So traditionally, going back to the monolith, Bleacher Report utilized MySQL running on RDS again within the Amazon world. These days, all of our new development we're relying on Postgres on the back end, which we believe is more performant. Just to kind of throw that out there, we could talk about that for an hour, but.
And we also have used ETS tables a bit, which are the Erlang term storage, which can come as part of Erlang, and where traditionally we'd used Redis in the past, we've used ETS tables, and it's made our life a lot easier. And they're also, because things are running so smoothly, we wanted to use ETS in other places, but we don't really see the need for extra caching. So Postgres and ETS are sort of what we use now.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll add there that I think is interesting. We've adopted as a best practice putting a Fastly CDN endpoint or service on top of all services that we put out there, even if that means having a TTL of 0. which we would have to have, for example, for our content stream, right? Given the dynamic nature of the content that's being served, but having that CDN in front of it provides us not only shielding if for some reason we were to have an issue that caused a service to stop performing, maybe based on an external dependencies, or also just request collapsing itself has been a huge benefit. So that alone has eliminated a lot of need for external caching, even in cases where perhaps we could benefit from it. Really moving that to the CDN layer.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Ben. I can tell you we're receiving about 5 questions in the time it takes us to answer one, so clearly we'll have to answer some of them in writing, but thanks to everyone in the audience for asking them. Moving right on to the next question, and here's a really interesting one from Phil. Phil is asking, one of the main gaps I've seen with Elixir is a de facto monitoring and metrics solution. Now, you mentioned an Elixir meter plus StatsD setup, but how do you handle alerting and the more nuanced things that tools such as New Relic provide in the Rails world? If you like, I can repeat that, but effectively Phil is asking, how do you handle alerting and the more nuanced things that tools like New Relic provide in the Rails world?
Well, we've used Accelerometer has been a really good solution for us. We also use Bugsnag to give us sort of error reporting, and we've been working with Erlang Solutions actually to use Wombat, which is their sort of all-in-one monitoring tool. And it's when we first started with them, there wasn't complete Elixir and Phoenix support, but now there is, and that's been really great to us because you can also see that you can see all of the metrics of the beam. So you can basically get everything in there without New Relic or these kind of things. And we use Datadog as well, so all of our metrics are piped to Datadog. And once the integration with Wombat, we'll be able to pipe those out to StatsD and Datadog as well. So while we don't have all of the sort of niceties of New Relic, we have been able to cobble them together in a very effective way, I think.
Thank you for that, Ben. And I would recommend, if you're interested in monitoring an Elixir or an Erlang system, then by all means check out our web pages, look at Wombat OAM, and see if it fits your particular needs. But just moving on straight to the next question for Dave and Ben. So we have Stefan asking, could you discuss in a bit more detail how you went from data modeling your data types to taking 20 minutes to deploy the data types?
Sure. So we originally thought of content types as as DB-backed models, and so that meant you had a table for, I don't know, post, podcast, or external article, or these kind of things, and that meant that every time that we had to do a new content type, we had to think about the model relationship, we had to do a migration, we had to come up with all these functions, or in the Ruby world, all these methods to support and validate this data. And then I didn't really touch on this too much, but in the refactoring stage, with those 2 graphs of additions and deletions, that was when we tried these different ways to model data, and we found that if we look at content types as sharing similar attributes in terms of, there's a generic part of the content that all content types have. There's parts that are metadata parts, and there's parts that the programmers edit. If we think about it in that terms, then we can make them much more generic, and then we can use the change sets to validate those. So we were able to get rid of this of a number of database tables and a number of models or modules in the Elixir world, and by using change sets, you just pass it through and you write functions based on those change sets, and that makes it much simpler to do without any database migrations and any other additional sort of boilerplate code.
Thank you for that. Now, we've formally breached our webinar time, but because we've received so many questions, we simply have to honor a few more of them, if that's okay with Dave and Ben. So we'll just move, thank you. We'll move straight on to the next one. We have an audience member asking, Would you comment in a bit more detail as to how your hosting is set up on AWS? Is it one server running everything? Is it a lot of services? And how do you do security between servers if we're talking about multiple services?
Yes, so good question. We are indeed running multiple servers for the database layer. As I mentioned, we're running RDS. As far as the deployment of our Elixir apps, we're leveraging Docker with Elastic Beanstalk on AWS, which has proven to be successful for us, both in terms of, again, the ability to scale, as well as some of the other niceties that it has. As far as security between servers, again, this is something that we could dive a little bit deeper on, but we've gone with an OAuth JUTS model that we believe is the best approach for us.
Thank you for that, Dave. Now, here's one that's very familiar to people in the world of Erlang. And quite a hot topic, excuse the pun. Marian is asking, do you use hot code loading in production? And if so, can you share in what context you might be using it?
This is something that we're working towards. Right now, as Dave mentioned, we use Docker and Elastic Beanstalk. And it's not hot code reloading, but just like with the development side of things, the ops side of things is we're trying iterative development or iterative ops deployment, I guess. The way things are working pretty well now, but we realize that we're not taking advantage of the number of things that Erlang and Elixir offer. One of the things that we want to move to quickly is XRM, which is the Elixir Release Manager. So it basically takes your application and turns it into a small binary. And which would speed up deployment times and these kind of things. So yeah, this is something that we haven't taken advantage of. It's on the radar, and it's just actually because things are working so well with the way that we have them now, we have other things that we prioritize. But yeah, this is something that we definitely want to look into.
Thank you for that. Now we really have very little time left, so we'll limit this to 3 more questions. And I'll try to ask you pragmatic ones that can help some of the Elixir sort of newbies in the audience. Now, just to ask a question coming from Pedro to begin with. How did you decide on the number of machines for the Elixir app? Was it a good guess, or was there a type of methodology that you applied to get to that number?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it was more art than science, and it continues to be. The approach that we take, it gets very complicated within an AWS world where you have so many different instance types that you can select from. And again, when you have when your understanding of both Elixir, I'm thinking back to a year ago, when your understanding of both Elixir and the service that you're developing are limited at the time, you kind of have to punt on that for a little bit. So I don't recall exactly what instance type probably we were using initially in staging, but generally speaking, the approach that we take when determining instance sizes is to first get our services up and running in a staging environment where we can blitz traffic and look for potential bottlenecks. So once we've optimized, let's call it a single unit of a service, from there we will increase the traffic load, oftentimes ghosting traffic from production to that service within the staging environment to look at, again, how does it react, how does it scale, and from there, and working with our DevOps team, we make an educated decision around the ideal instance type, and again, where we want to go ahead and set that threshold when we initially hit production. For some of the other apps, it's a little bit easier, again, on the Rails side, because when you get pounded by traffic, we can go into a new relic and see that this particular controller is the bottleneck, or this call out to Redis is the bottleneck, and scale up accordingly. With Elixir, again, it's been a little more challenging. So we put it at a level where we feel comfortable that should something happen, it can react. But kind of going back to early in the presentation, we still feel like we're a little over-provisioned compared to where we could be.
We also use the observer, the Erlang observer, which helps us identify bottlenecks as well as monitor traffic, which has been really helpful. So that's been good for us as well.
Thank you for that. We have time for no more than 2 questions, so I'll go straight ahead with the first one. And this is obviously practical from a perspective of learning Elixir. In regards to the order of books that you should read to master Elixir, would you have a recommendation that you could extend to our audience?
Yeah, first is the programming Elixir book by Dave Thomas, who is also of the Pickaxe Ruby book. He's moved to Elixir as well. It's very good. I would recommend reading the first couple of, I believe there are 4 main sections. The first is basic Elixir syntax and use them, and then the next chunk is more about OTP, which is very important, especially in understanding how Phoenix is structured. And once you've done that, then I would recommend the Programming Phoenix book by Chris McCord, the creator of Phoenix, Jose Balim, the creator of Elixir, and Bruce Tate, who is working on both. It goes into very good detail about how Phoenix is structured and about how that it gives you a real-life example of building an app using channels and just CRUD app type stuff. And then I think those should be enough to get anyone off the ground.
Thank you for that. Now, Michael is asking a really interesting question, and I think we can finish with that. He's basically saying, can you give us any examples on how to benchmark Elixir apps?
So there's a few Elixir benchmarking libraries. One is Benchfella, and Elixometer, which is a wrapper for Xometer. We use that to benchmark controller actions and these kind of things. And you just sort of in the pipeline, you put a Xometer plug, and it tells you, we use that to monitor the controller actions as well as the database times. Also, you can, because it's an Erlang library, you can measure the atoms and these kind of things as well. And what else do we use? Those have been, I guess those are the real, the most beneficial things. And again, we also use the observer to do more real-time benchmarking, and then exporting that data to Datadog or StatsD is how we monitor them over time.
Thank you for that, Dave and Ben. We've significantly breached the time we've had, but it was absolutely worth it. Now, I'd just like to thank you once again for a fantastic speech on the use of Elixir at Bleacher Report, most inspiring. And I would also like to thank all of our members of the audience who joined us for the webinar today. Please join us again for our next monthly webinar. Now, following today, we will send you a short survey to make sure we capture your feedback of today's webinar. Please also note that the recording of the webinar and the presentation that was shared with you today will become available for you to collect on the Erlang Solutions' corporate website at www.erlang-solutions.com. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.